Okay, should we begin? Okay, let's first do a sound check. Don't think that sound is high enough. Test, 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 test. Okay, can you guys hear me okay?
Now I can.
Okay, what about the people in back who are talking? This is what? And parking. All right, Ed, can you guys hear me back? Ed, can you hear me okay? Can you guys hear me okay or not? Well, I meant way in back. Can you guys hear me? Gina, can you hear me? Gina of the wine glass, can you hear me? Is it not strong enough? Okay, here's a question. Should I turn it up or not? It's fine? Okay. I'm going to hit the record button. All right. So if I'm 90% sure the Pope has asked us to say a Hail Mary to Our Lady of Good Hope for peace in the world. So why don't we begin in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. So, number one, thank you for all those who made coffee and the Ukrainian honey babka. Well, I know I worked hard on it this morning. I get up in the morning and I'm more of a baker. Anyhow, we're continuing with our evidence for God, just because this the number one assault I actually think is with atheists. The new atheists, that's a whole movement, they're strongly trying to encourage our kids to give up the faith. So just still going over some proofs. One evidence of God is consciousness. The principle of consciousness is that, here's the odd part. We know there is a self, even if we can't define what a self or consciousness is. So it's called the problem of the mind. In science, we know that there's a mind/consciousness, but the mind and the brain are not the same thing. We know we have a consciousness, but we physically can't locate it. So if atheists only accept things that are empirically true, that you can touch, taste, and feel, what about consciousness? Because it can't be empirically found. Yet, all the evidence is we know that there is one, right? Like, use the example of placebos. That I could give you a placebo, and amazingly, the mind will believe it, and it'll have the same effect. You've heard those placebo studies. But the point being is that the same way we can't locate the consciousness physically, we just know it's in and through us. Well, why can't the same be said of God then, if you can't find the consciousness? God is in and through us, beyond us, but we can't physically locate it. So that's the problem of consciousness. Or, here's another evidence of God. I really like this one, is beauty. And there is this professor I really like. She's a botanist who gave this interview on why she became this scientist. And she says, why is because, and I think this is funny, she says, as a little kid, I wanted to know why goldenrod and purple asters look so beautiful together. And she says, why is it? And so they asked her when she was working on her PhD how she got into science. And she says, oh, because I wanted to know why goldenrod and asters look so beautiful together. I just loved it. And she says, what I discovered is that science asks a different question. But science can sharpen our appreciation of beauty. And beauty can raise questions about science. Now, she admits, there turns out that there is a biological reason why those two colors grow together. And deals with, because of the spectrum, you'll get more pollinators. So they tend to grow together because they succeed. But science learns about flowers, is what she said. Looking with beauty is what you learn from flowers. And looking with beauty, even as a scientist, she said, that's one of the evidences of God. Or this other man tells a story that during World War II in 1943, he was living in this, his father was living in this Greek-occupied town, and one night, despite the fact that horrible things were going on in the town, they're hurting for food, they were scared, the Nazis were there. It was a depressing time, but suddenly, in the darkness, in their village, this trumpet player played this morning serenata. And his father said it's the most beautiful thing that had ever happened in his life. He said, that song has stayed with me for years. And he said, the whole village stopped just for a moment to listen to that. And many people just started to cry because it was so beautiful, and it gave them hope. And his father said, it's beauty that is this spiritual moment with God. His point being is it wasn't just sound waves hitting their ears that made people cry. It was the hope the music gave. And so his father says, hasn't beauty ever touched you so much that for a moment you believe in God? Or near-death experiences, I'll talk about those in a second. But I chose a story about the guy who goes in front of the light, through the tunnel, through the light, and he says he never felt such love like this his entire life. And he thought to himself, as an excuse, well, why didn't anybody ever tell me about this love? And the light said, oh, there was evidence. You just ignored it. Like, there's beauty and evidence all around it. You have to train yourself to ignore it. And even Einstein, who believed in God, said there's so much beauty. He said he believed in God because there's order and harmony and beauty and simplicity and elegance in the world. So he said he believed in the God of Spinoza, that the universe is so gorgeous. I just think it's interesting Einstein said that. So we would say the beauty of creation, it points to God. Now, depending on what evidence you'll admit, you'll see beauty as pointing to God, not explaining God, just road signs to God. Now, I mention this because atheists won't accept this. And Richard Dawkins, kind of the Pope of the atheists, he said this. And in this book, article, he titled The Hubris of Religion. Now, just note, hubris means pride. The article is called The Hubris of Religion. Now, talk about people in glass houses. But he concocts this cacophony of hypocrisy. So let me just read what he wrote. He said, pride can be justified, and science does so in spades. So does Beethoven, so does Shakespeare, Michelangelo, Christopher Wren. So do the engineers who built the giant telescopes in Hawaii and the Canary Islands, the radio telescopes, and the very large arrays that stare sightless into the orbiting sky, or the Hubble telescope. These engineering feats, deep underground at CERN, literally move me to tears when I visit them. Now, in that statement, there's nothing wrong with the sentiments, but later in these sentiments in this piece, but previously, just before this, he said that the material philosophy, that there is no such thing as morality or beauty. We're just chemical robots. He says that we're just chemical robots. There is no such thing as morality or beauty. And then he follows it up by this plea of beauty. What does he think is permissible to praise about Shakespeare and Michelangelo or Christopher Wren, all who were Christians? He admires their artistic beauty, but then he just finished saying that there is no such thing as beauty. He said anything that's not scientific and empirical is nonsense. And then he quotes how much he's moved by Shakespeare and Christopher Wren and Michelangelo. Why does he quote works of atheists as beautiful. He doesn't. He quotes the works of Christians. What a hypocrite. You just said that there's no beauty, and then you go off on naming all these things. He's stealing some of their sophistication. As a strict materialist, Richard Dawkins doesn't believe in transcendent beauty. So why is he telling this story about crying when he sees beauty? For Richard Dawkins, he said music is just sound waves in your ear. If that's true, why are you talking about Beethoven? Praising the immaterial beauty of music or art as transcendent if you don't believe in a transcendent God. He unintentionally condemns his own atheistic philosophy by quoting Christian artists whose faith was expressed in art. And Richard Dawkins has this dogmatic insistence that all atheists must be materialists, that there is no such thing as beauty or morality. If that's true, and he says all knowledge only comes from science, but that statement I just read, that's not a scientific statement. That's a statement about beauty. So Richard Dawkins is so dogmatic about his atheism that he can't even see his own hypocrisy. He cites art's ability that makes him tear up, but he doesn't believe in beauty. For religion, art is a different type of knowledge. It just expresses this praise of God. Shakespeare was Catholic. He doesn't seem that he praises beauty. Richard Dawkins doesn't praise beauty. He says religion poisons everything. He says religion poisons everything. Yet Shakespeare, Christopher Wren, Michelangelo, they are all religious characters. I guess that's not true. And just on this idea of beauty, this drives me up a wall. Because Richard Dawkins will say, well, Einstein was an atheist. No, he was not. He would say, he said Martin Luther King was an atheist. I don't know if you know your history. He wasn't. But then he also says, Vincent van Gogh and Claude Monet were atheists. That's not really true. Vincent van Gogh was a minister at one time. He had some psychological issues. Claude Monet had deep problems with the Catholic Church, but his wife was a very devout Catholic, and his best friend was a priest. They weren't atheists. Or even literature. This one, actually he's not a saint, but he's hopefully will be a saint. His name was Father Seraphim Rose. He's actually part of the reason why I came to Coeur d'Alene. I wanted to come north because St. Jacob of Alaska and Seraphim Rose, I was praying to him, but Seraphim Rose was this, as a teenager, proclaimed himself as an atheist. I'm going to just quickly tell a story. As an atheist, he thought he knew everything as a teenager and proclaimed himself an atheist. But then he's gifted in language. He learned multiple languages, taken up with literature, and he says it's literature that caused him to gain his religious vocation. Because with literature he discovered beauty, and with beauty he discovered God, and he ends up becoming a monk/priest. He was actually brilliant, but the point being is that for Seraphim Rose, he was an atheist who becomes a priest because of literature. Beauty changes people. And I do think he's amazing because his body is one of the incorruptibles, and when they opened it, it had the smell of roses. All these miracles happened, but what converted him from atheism was literature. And like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, he's a famous writer, right? And at one point, he's an atheist, but he makes one terrible mistake in his life of making a joke about Stalin's mustache, which he didn't find funny. So he referred to Stalin as the man with a mustache. And his punishment sends him to the Gulag. Now, you know Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He sends him to the Gulag, but oddly enough, it's in the Gulag where he becomes spiritual and writes this great masterpiece. But for him, it was both suffering and beauty that turned Alexander Solzhenitsyn back to God. So my point being is that, I believe beauty is one of the evidences of God. Now, that's still on the other side. I want to change the subject to personal arguments from God. So I went cosmological, that's all the science stuff, and then human reasons, that's biology and psychology. I consider literature and beauty part of the psychology group. But then also, there's a lot of evidence for God just based on people's personal experience. Like for my belief of God, I always believed in God. And I remember I just always believed in God. And I don't want to get too much into it, but when I was a little kid, and it was before my first communion, I remember this, where we went to Mass we're in Montana, and all of a sudden there was this golden light everywhere during Mass, and I felt such incredible love that I started to cry. And I remember my mother said, "Why are you crying?" Well, because it was just so beautiful, and I felt so loved. And anyhow, the point being is, even after that, when I was a kid, I'd have these dreams of God, and God would speak to me, but God would always appear in the color orange. And that's because that golden light was really kind of an orangey gold light that was everywhere, and it was thick. I remember that. So I've always believed in God. But that's my personal experience. But it's just not my personal experience. Do you know how many millions of people throughout the ages have had some sort of experience with God? It's their personal experience with God. There's this illusionist, Darren Brown, who was arguing with this pop star turned media priest, Richard Coles, in this debate. And the magician says, well, you people get, it could have been tricks. I do tricks all the time. These people you think are miracles are tricks. And so he says to the rock star turned priest, says, well, why did you convert from atheism? Because a priest at one time was an atheist. And he says, because I had an experience with Christ. It wasn't a magic trick. Or even Blaise Pascal, the famous, brilliant, he was a super genius mathematician. He's this great mathematician. At age like 8, he came up with a theorem. At age 13, he comes up with a theorem. Brilliant mind, but he has this mystical experience one night that lasts for several hours. And he calls it the night of fire. And he describes it, writes it down, and then pins it to his shirt. So whatever shirt he was wearing had the night of fire description that he carried to his heart. He died with it close to his heart. You can go and look it up. But my point being is that what changed Blaise Pascal was this personal experience with God. And if you're going to look for evidence of God, why would you dismiss the personal experience of billions of people over thousands and thousands of years? So C.S. Lewis said, if everybody says, oh, I got a letter, and I got a letter, and I got a letter in my box, but let's say me as an atheist, I never got a letter, you don't get to say, well, nobody received a letter. If they tell you they got a letter, after 10,000 years and billions of people saying, no, they had a personal experience of God, you're just not allowing the evidence. Or there's this other book I read called God of the Waves. Anybody else read that book but me? It was a scientist who, he grows up in fundamentalist Christianity. And really, he has a major problems with fundamentalistic Christianity. So finally he tells his wife, I don't believe in God. And he declares himself an atheist. But what's really kind of interesting is that later he has this mystical experience of God. When he's at the beach, he's actually in San Diego on a business trip, and he's looking at the waves, and he has this mystical experience of God. So he reconverts back to theism. But he said, why I left fundamentalist Christianity is I had a problem with how they defined God. But he's a scientist. Once I had that mystical experience of God, I did believe, there is a God, just not the God that of their harshness. But my point being is that that's another person who has this experience. Do you know how many thousands of years human beings have had that? I don't have enough faith in atheism to believe that billions of people over 10,000 years, that I should just dismiss all their evidence. I find that shockingly self-absorbed, that only my evidence, and that's what atheists are saying, only my experiences matter. Not saying it's a slam dunk, but how can you, if you're in a court case, right, and you have billions of people who witness something, and you say, well, I didn't witness it, so it can't be true. That's just arrogance. Does that make sense? So yes, I consider personal experience of billions of people over 10,000 years evidence you should look at. The other evidence that I think you really need to look at, and I love this stuff, is near-death experiences. I'm a huge fan of them. Do you know about 13 million people that have had near-death experiences? And for you to be an atheist, you have to deny all 13 million. Now, near-death experiences, they were first explored by this doctor named Dr. Moody, who discovered in his patients the same story that they would tell him. And with modern medicine increasing, you can revive people who have died for a short time. So Moody starts to record all these experiences. The first book is called Life After Life, and he just records hundreds of these experiences. Then more doctors go. There are now tons of books and studies about it, but it's not really anything new. Plato, the reason why he came up with his philosophy, the analogy of the cave, that all of us are like a cave and the light is outside, but we're in here and we don't see things. The real reality is where the light is. Where did Plato get that? He got that because this Armenian soldier, had died, but when they put him on the funeral pyre, he wakes up. And he tells the story that there is this place of light and color that he went to. That got Plato thinking. St. Duratham in the 700s writes about this experience of going through a dark tunnel in a bright light. Now, he's a saint, but it's a near-death experience if you read it. St. Bede has the same story. Hemingway tells this story where he didn't go through the tunnel, but Hemingway himself tells the story that he was in this accident and his body floated above, his body. Could be delusion. But now they've done all these recordings. Now, there's so many books out. But that's, roughly 13 million people that have a near-death experiences. And then Stanford University, they did one with study of children. They had like 4,000 children who had near-death experiences, but they were toddlers. But because they lacked verbal skills, they had them draw what they saw. You know what 4,000 children drew? A talking rainbow. That when they died, like a bright light might be too much, so maybe God appeared as a talking rainbow. Or people that had been blind since birth. There's a book, I forget the name of that book, Mind's Eye or something like that. There's all people who have been blind. So there's just so many stories. I could go on for that forever. So I collect them. I don't know. Did you guys ever read any of those near-death? There's a whole TV show, like this doctor. She drowns while kayaking, sees the dead, goes through so many stories. My point being is that for you to be an atheist, you have to not only deny the billions of people who had personal experiences with God, but then the 13 million that said, no, there is a life after this. And think about this. If you're just wrong about that one thing, that's a really big thing to be wrong about. If that one thing is right, that there is life after death, everything in atheism is wrong. And like I told you about the story of, read that story, Unexpected Journey, the pilot who dies, and literally they know he was brain dead for 13 hours and tells this experience of heaven. Or this sounds kind of strange. There's atheists who have had near-death experiences. So the atheists that have near-death experiences often convert, but not all of them do. This one atheist, Ed Ayers, says that there's this red light, said after he went through the tunnel and there was this red light, and he was shocked. He said, well, it does prove that death, there's not an end to one's consciousness, but it doesn't prove that there's a God. Well, that's a lot. Or this one atheist from England went through the tunnel and there was darkness, but he did see that there was a light out in the distance. And he says, all I knew is that I wanted to extinguish that light. And somebody said, well, doesn't that prove that there's life after death? You had this near-death experience. And he said, oh, no, that's just something that happened in my head, which is kind of funny because J.K. Rowling, when he said that, J.K. Rowling, in that Harry Potter series, when Dumbledore, Harry has a near-death experience, and he asks Dumbledore, his professor, he says, is this real or is this just happening inside my head? And Dumbledore turns around and says, well, of course it's happening in your head. Why wouldn't that make it real? Well, everything happens in our head. And she says, I waited 5 years to use that line because the atheist had said, it's just something that happens in your head. But what I thought was really interesting is that, wow, the atheist can have an experience, see the light in the distance, and still wants to extinguish God. Or, this is a different one, this young surfer Ian, he knew he was dying because he had been stung by all the multiple box jellyfish, and in the ambulance, his life starts to slip away, so he cries out for forgiveness. And the only prayer he knew was the Lord's Prayer that his mother taught him, and then he passed away. He says, I came out, I'm going to read what he said, I came out of the end of a tunnel and seemed to be standing upright in front of the source of all light and power. My whole vision was taken up with this incredible light. It looked like a white fire or a mountain of cut diamonds sparkling with the most incredible brilliance. And as I stood there, questions kept racing through my heart. Is this just a force like the Buddhist or karma or yin-yang? Is this just some innate power or energy source? I was still questioning all of it, and a voice spoke to me from the center of the light. It asked, Ian, do you want to return? I replied, if I'm out of my body, I don't know where I am. I want to return. The person of light said, if you want to return, Ian, you must see with a new light. He says, I found myself beginning to weep uncontrollably as the love became stronger and stronger. It was so clean and so pure, no strings attached. God showed me that when I asked for forgiveness in the ambulance, it was then that God forgave me. This love was healing my heart, and I began to understand there is this incredible hope for humanity in this love. So anyhow, my point being is that you have all these great experiences. And Richard Dawkins' reply to this is, religion teaches us the ridiculous idea that death is not the end. So for all that, he simply discounts it, that all those people are wrong. Can you get more of a hypocrite and selfish? You're just, more people, you're simply refusing their evidence. Or, this sounds kind of strange, my third personal argument is the communion of saints. It's not quite near death, but this sounds kind of strange. Do you know how many times people in my priesthood, just as they're dying, they see the dead? I regret. I should have written down all these stories because I have so many that I forget. I cannot tell you how many times I go to the hospital and somebody's dying and they call out the name of somebody who's died. I just love this work. I was with this, like there's just, I'd go over, I'm going to tell you, like my great-grandmother, before she died, they gathered together and they're praying the rosary, and suddenly she wakes up from this coma and holds out her hands and she says, "Pa." That's what she called her husband, and died. My own grandmother, the day before she died, she said that she could see her sister Jen, who had died years before, so we just ignored her. And then she did die. And before she died, she kept just repeating, "Everything's all right. Len's here. Len's here." Len was my grandfather. 30-some years ago, when I was first ordained a priest, this teenage girl died. And before the teenage girl died, she woke up and she turned to her mother and she says, "Mom, do you hear it? It's so beautiful." And she says, "They're here." And she reached out her hand. This girl, other girl, she went through the windshield in a car accident with her mother outside of Grangeville. And she says to me later, she says, much later, she says, "I think I died." And I said, "Well, why do you think you died?" She says, "I went through the windshield, I was in a lot of pain, then suddenly I was out of pain." And he said, all these people were standing there. And, it's just this field. All of a sudden, all these people are standing there, and they're coming towards me. And then I heard my mother scream, and I turned to look at my mother, and I was back in my body and in incredible pain. Anyhow, or another story, this guy not practicing Catholic, not a good practice. Well, he does. He's a Christmas and Easter. But good egg. So he actually went to my parish, but he was from Emmett or Weezer. I think it's Emmett. Anyhow, he's like a true hunter, like a real hunter, and slightly older than me. But anyhow, so he goes hunting with two of his friends, except they take mules because they go in the backcountry. And I guess he was on his mule or something. I don't remember that part. But the mule loses its footing, and somehow he gets thrown to the ground. And when he falls, his rib punctures his lung. So he's going to die. He's going to die, and this is the part that gets crazy. So he's dying. He knows his lungs punctured, and his son died years ago. He says suddenly, and he's not like a religious fanatic. He says, "My son appeared right before me." And the problem is that they're trying to get Lifeline because they took out their cell phones, and miraculously, they have bars. So they call Lifeline at St. Al's, and they're talking to the guy at St. Al's, and the kid who's answering the phone says, "Well, just give me your GPS." And they said, "Well, we don't know where we are." And he says, "No, it's on your phone." He says, "Just pull up this. It'll give us the GPS." So they pull it up, and they can't see it because none of them brought readers. Seriously, the guy's dying, and nobody has readers, and they can't read what the GPS is. So the kid at St. Al says, "Oh, no, this is what you can do. Take a screenshot." So then they had to say, "How do you take a screenshot?" It tells them how to take a screenshot, and then texted it to his cell phone so that he could look at it. Isn't that amazing? But the whole time that craziness is going on, the guy, the hunter, the father, he said his son stayed with him, and he says, "Dad, don't worry, the helicopter will get here in time." And the son stayed there the whole time until the helicopter came. Now, if you met him, he's not a BSer, he's not, super crazy religious person, but he said, and he told me the story, his son was there. So, I know this sounds kind of strange. Not just me, but do you know, I have probably 1,000 stories the same way. To me, that's evidence of God and an afterlife. Is that, how could you dismiss all those thousands of stories? No, honestly, God, anybody here have stories similar? If you've been there when somebody died, there's something miraculous there. Okay, now changing it. So once again, atheists refuse that evidence and refuse that evidence. Now there's another one, and this gets a little esoteric, and it's called the Satiation of Desires. So what that is that it's a nice phrase, but it just means that all the love and joy and gratitude and longing that we experience are actually proofs of God. That love and joy point to something greater. Now, that sounds strange, but that's why Dorothy Day converted from atheism. Dorothy Day, this sounds kind of strange. Dorothy Day was this communist atheist, and she gets pregnant, and her boyfriend says, no, you have to have an abortion, so she does. And she gets pregnant again, except this time she says, no, I'm going to have the baby. And he said, you have that baby, we're through. She kept the baby. But she said, when she gave birth and they put her daughter in her arms, she says, I felt such incredible joy at that moment. I knew I was wrong. There had to be a God. So anyhow, the point being is that, that sense of joy and love and longing, that's evidence of another world. Or just take it this way for a second. If you were a child in the womb and all you knew was darkness, how could that child in the womb have any proof of a world outside the womb? Of grass and sunshine and birds and flowers and animals. What proof in the womb would there be? What proof would you have? It would be you. You're the proof, in the sense that you have hands and fingers and legs that were meant to run and eyes that were meant to see colors and hands that were meant to stretch out. Every human being in every culture in every time period has this desire for something more. Like a child in the womb, I know I was meant for more. This place of unity and justice. So C.S. Lewis, who was the head atheist in England, who then has this convert, converts, becomes this writer. And he points out that when he looks back at his life, he always had this longing. All the joy and love in his life simply pointed to something greater. And he said, it is Christ who you seek when you dream of happiness. He is waiting for you when nothing else will satisfy you. It is the beauty which you are attracted to. It is he who provokes you with that thirst that will not compromise for less. It is he who stirs the desires for something greater in your life. So the satiation of desires is that you have this thirst and hunger for something more. It leads to more life. So the same way, you know that you have this desire for water, right? When you're thirsty, you desire water. Why would you have that thirst for water unless there is some way to satiate that thirst? By drinking water. Does that make sense? You have the same way you have a desire for water, you know water exists, it just may not be right there. You have in your love and hope and joys, it gives you a hunger that never is completely fulfilled. So like C.S. Lewis calls it, the fragrance of a land that I haven't been to. All the joys and hope and beauties, it speaks about this place that I haven't been to. Now, atheists' response to this is that their lack of desire, that desires don't prove the existence of God. But I'd say, well, your lack of desire doesn't prove that God doesn't exist. I don't just psychologically believe in God. I believe in God because everything, all the joys and loves, has this thirst for something more. So all these emotional longings, yeah, they can prove an existence of God. The lack of desire for God is not proof of a non-existence of God. And oddly enough, they did this study on people as they grow older. And people change. Their beliefs change the older they get. Younger people actually test out to be more atheistic. But older people, after you suffered sickness and pain and joy and love and loss, they're more likely to change. So I'd say I do believe even our desires point to God, but also a lifetime of experiences is proof. So that's my fifth one. that I really do believe over a lifetime, you change. So just using a little literature, Hamlet, it's kind of funny because at the beginning of Hamlet, the guards ask him this question, who's there? And it's a great question because who is Hamlet at the beginning of the play is not who Hamlet is at the end of the play. So you have this repeated question, who is there? Who Hamlet is at the beginning is not who he is at the end. We change. And when we change, how we see the world and truth changes. So when God says, I am, God is the one thing that never changes. So an atheist of his youth can easily be an atheist. It's harder to be an atheist the older you get. So an example would be the actor Anthony Hopkins, if you know who he is. Anthony Hopkins always was this rabid atheist. So he's in the middle of an interview, and in the interviewer mentions that he's an atheist. And he says, I'm not an atheist anymore. And the interviewer is shocked and says, well, I thought you always proclaimed yourself to be an atheist. How come you're no longer an atheist? And he goes, why am I not an atheist? Life! I just think that's kind of funny. So anyhow, now he's no longer an atheist. He says, I feel every day, as I get older anyway, that it's all a miracle. I mean, my heart beats, my lungs breathe. It's all extraordinary. It's this extraordinary phenomenon. Life taught him there is a God. I think that's kind of interesting. Now, this sounds kind of strange. Do you know who Jean-Paul Sartre was? Famous writer, atheist. Atheists always quote him. He was a big-time atheist. Great writer. But here's the really odd part. And he was kind of disgusting. He was sexually aggressive. But as he gets older, he has this dramatic change. And his assistant was Levi Wright, said that he had this huge change of heart and mind the older he got. And he started to gravitate towards God. And so before his death, this sounds kind of strange, before his death, he calls for a priest. And he makes this profession of faith. So this is according to Pierre Victor, who was there. I do not feel that I am a product, this is what, Sartre said. I do not feel that I am a product of chance or a speck of dust in the universe, but someone who has expected and prepared and prefigured. In short, a being that only a creator could put here. And this idea of a created hand is referred to as God. So before he dies, he calls for a priest, he confesses his sins, and he dies as a Catholic. You know who else? Camus. Camus, he's actually a better writer, brilliant mind. Camus starts off, well, I guess he's Catholic, but starts off, he's not Catholic, but grew up actually in French Algiers. But anyhow, as a teenager, he's this hardcore atheist, and he is for most of his life. But then he starts to go to church, and he loves it. And he loves going to church, starts going to church regularly on Sundays, then starts to have lunch with the priest. And he said, I didn't like the idea of a world without God, that music and beauty and literature taught them that there was this God. And he once met Simone Weil, who he said to her in confidence that he admired her faith and wanted to have faith like hers. And so he starts going to church and Mass. He's reading the Bible, he said 3 times a day. And before he died, he asked to be rebaptized, but he gets in the car accident and dies. So, no offense, when any atheist ever quotes Camus, I said, oh, the guy that wanted to be rebaptized before he died, that was going to Mass, or C.S. Lewis was an atheist, now becomes a defender. Or Anthony Flew, who writes his book, he writes a book, There Is a God. What's important about that is that Anthony Flew, he was this huge atheist. And he's this huge atheist who said, he always put years and years of putting down, arguing against atheism. And yet, as an old man, he comes to realize there's just too much beauty and intelligent design to deny that there is a God. So he becomes this full-time theist. Now, my point being is that those are personal experiences that I think are evidence of God. Now, Socrates said, you have to follow the argument wherever it goes. Or it's often translated, and I like the mistranslation, follow the evidence wherever it goes. That was Socrates' motto. Follow the evidence wherever it goes. So, like, just going over the classes, last couple, we have cosmological arguments, scientific arguments for God. We have biological, human, literature, beauty arguments for God. We have billions of people's of experience of God, of near-death experiences. People over a lifetime suddenly change their views that there is a God. But the atheist, Richard Dawkins, says, no, that's not good enough evidence. How much evidence do you need for the love of God? And here's the thing. And I know this sounds kind of strange because the class was evidence for God. So don't ever be afraid to argue an atheist. You have more than enough proof. But the real problem is, and this is what I think, atheists don't believe in God because they don't want to believe in God. And just no offense, C.S. Lewis said the same thing. No offense, but Francis Collins, this famous world-class biologist, said, no, I didn't want there to be a God because I wanted to sleep around with whoever I wanted to sleep around with. I didn't want there to be a moral authority. So, it was a position of a teenager that you've just held on. And then when they asked Richard Dawkins why he became an atheist, Richard Dawkins says it was because he was a teenager. Now, no offense to teenagers out there, but you don't even have a fully developed brain yet. Now, it's not going to be after you're teenagers that all the wiring is complete. So even with not a fully developed brain, as a teenager in England, an upper-class, very wealthy family, he decided that there couldn't be a God, that there wouldn't ever be enough evidence. Well, yeah, there won't be because you're just nothing more than a teenager your entire life. He didn't base his belief that there is no God on science. He was only 16 years old. He decided the conclusion and then worked backwards, that there could never be enough evidence. So Richard Dawkins likes to tell people that atheists are intellectuals and religious people make their decisions based on emotions. But then he tells a story that as a teenager, he emotionally decided that there was no God. He can't even see his own hypocrisy. Or Bertrand Russell, who is this mathematician, but, Bertrand Russell, God help him, he said his main reason for believing in atheism is that he wanted sexual freedom. That he believed in free love, cheated on his wife all the time. But, that's not really based on evidence. That's just obstinance. Or Christopher Hitchens said that even if there was a heaven, he wouldn't be there since he would refuse to live under God's dictatorship. Which I think is kind of funny. So his brother, Peter Hitchens, also was this atheist, argued for atheism. But then Peter Hitchens has this conversion. And Peter Hitchens says, well, if you could have a conversion, why wouldn't Christopher? And he says, you know what? This is true. In England at the time period, we came from wealthy families. Christopher Hitchens, they came from a wealthy English family. Richard Dawkins, wealthy English family. And he says it was just kind of this rite of passage as a teenager to call yourself a atheist. Just what, we weren't choosing it. He says we just wanted to be rebellious and there is no God, so we'll sleep around with whoever we want. He says, sadly, his brother Christopher, who he loved, he says, he never left that. So anyhow, Christopher Hitchens says he'd never be under the dictatorship of heaven, even if heaven is love. Well, that's really sad. That's just being an obstinate teenager. So they're not rejecting God based on logic or evidence. They're rejecting God based on their personal experience. So I know this sounds strange. I did a whole class, and I could go even longer in these classes, but I can tell people get bored. There's a lot of evidence. It's just that they don't want it. They make their decision they like to say, oh, I believe in science, not religion. You're not a scientist. But they make it based on a personal choice. So just a story, like after one of the masses, this was in Meridian, this young kid starts chewing me out because he didn't like my homily. I can't remember what was wrong with this, but I did mention atheism, and he says, well, you shouldn't be putting down atheists. That's not loving. So anyhow, so he says that. So, he says that to me. So I said, oh, you're sleeping with your girlfriend. And you could see his shock, and I said it just to be shocking. He says, well, yeah. I said, so you really have a personal reason that you don't want a God. You know what I mean? Like, and I know I was being obnoxious, but like his reason that there couldn't be a God is because I want to do what I want to do. That, I hate to say it, that's 99% of it. I just want to do what I want to do. And Christopher Hitchens, he describes God as a North Korean dictator who's just trying to control people's sex lives. And so, actually, when he was asked, he says, if Christianity could be proven, would you convert? And he said, no, I would not convert because I don't want anybody controlling my sex life. Well, that's not based on evidence. Does that make it, that's just still being a willful teenager. So it's not a head issue, even though, you can answer every objection of an atheist, and I think we have more than enough evidence that there is a God, there is an afterlife. They don't want to be. Atheists are looking for God the same way a criminal is looking for a cop. They don't want to find a cop, and so they will not find a cop. They don't want a God, and they won't find a God. And the great mathematician Blaise Pascal said, people arrive at opinions not based on evidence, but what's attractive to them. If they're attracted to the good and the beautiful and the moral, they will find God. If they are attracted to power and prestige and sex and autonomy, they will not find God. I think Blaise Pascal is right. You first have to decide what you're attracted to. So if you're wondering, well, why is he going off on that? Because I think personal experiences matter, life matters. And so that's one of the evidence. The fifth evidence is life itself. But if you make your personal decision that my life is about me, what I'm attracted to is power, sex, money, then you will never find enough evidence for God. Not, anyhow, like Anthony Hopkins. Why did you change? Why are you no longer an atheist? Life. The sixth one, and this is kind of obvious, is miracles. There's a lot of miracles. There's this book I really liked called Miracle Hunter. Did anybody else read that book? Nobody reads? Nobody likes books. Did you read the book? Oh, is it really? And it has a guy from Rolling Stones? So this, I'm curious. Now I have to check it out because I'm embarrassed. But I read his book. I really like it, where he's this Rolling Stone writer who just doesn't, you need to make some money. And of all places, in Boardman, Oregon, because he was in Portland. Have you guys ever heard of Boardman? So if you go to why do you know Boardman? Were you there? Did you? Oh, wow. Okay, now I'm going to harass you. So in Boardman, Oregon, there appeared the Virgin Mary on the side of a $200 trailer. And what's that? It lasted for days. And it was just this cheap trailer in a migrant camp. And the people who owned the trailer weren't even practicing Catholics. It's a really interesting story. And people came from all over to see this. They can't figure out, why is this image of Our Lady just on the side of this trailer? So anyhow, I kind of believe it because she said people started going to church and practice their faith again. And the priest, who actually left the priesthood, I went to seminary with him in the Dalles, said, well, that can't be true. If Mary appears anywhere, she would appear in church. And the woman who owned the trailer said, well, we're the ones who are poor. Why wouldn't Mary appear among us? And they said, well, but you're not practicing your faith. And she says, yeah, that's because the priests there always choose us out when we go to Mass. And being migrants, they have to work on Sundays, so they don't get to go and then if you can't go to communion because you missed Mass, but you had to miss Mass because you can barely afford to eat. Like, do you know what I mean? Why wouldn't a Mary? And then it was accompanied with all these miracles. Now, the point being is that he's just this writer who's trying to look for a gig. But the problem is he goes and sees it. And he kind of has this beginning of a conversion. So then he spends all his spare time first looking at Marian apparitions and Medjugorje, and then he writes this whole book, The Miracle Hunter, and he obviously has a conversion. But the point being is that there's so many miracles in life, if you really look at it. Our Lady de Guadalupe, Lourdes, all these miracles. And, I mean, I could have a whole class on miracles, but once again, after seeing hundreds of miracles, or at least stories of hundreds of miracles, if you're an atheist, you can't believe in miracles. You have to dismiss not only billions of people's of testimony of a personal experience, millions of people's near-death experiences, thousands of stories of people later in life coming to believe, stories of the communion of saints, but also hundreds of stories of miracles that you can go. Like, I was shocked when I was in Croatia, and we went to this church, St. Blaise, and there's a incorruptible below the altar. First time I've ever seen an incorruptible. You know what an incorruptible is, right? Somebody whose body hasn't decayed. So they actually found it in a field, and they found this, it looks like an 18-year-old boy, and his body hasn't decayed for 2,000 years. So they put it under the altar in a glass, and it looks just like a kid sleeping there. And they didn't even know the name of the person. Well, they gave him a name because he didn't have a name, but they technically didn't know his name, and his body hasn't corrupted in 2,000 years. My point being is that there's these miracles. And just the last one, meaning. I know that sounds strange, but remember, atheism says that there is no meaning in life. Theism says, no, there is a meaning to the world. But positive psychologists have discovered that if you decide to make decisions based on what will make you happy, you will never get to happy. But actually, if you make your decisions based on meaning, you will more likely end up at being happy. And we have the highest standard of living than any people have ever had in human race. And yet, our young have the highest suicide rate. So clearly, just having every material possession does not lead to happiness. And what they discovered is part of the ingredients of happiness is meaning. And yet atheists say there is no meaning in life. But like in this book, The Power of Meaning, meaning leads to happiness. And so in a sense, it sounds kind of strange, look at Viktor Frankl. In World War II, he was this Jew who was put into concentration camp, but he's a psychologist, and he tries to figure out, why do some people survive and other people not survive? And those people who believe life had a meaning, that suffering had a meaning, they would survive. No offense, look at, you know what the first ever piece of human writing was in literature? The Epic of Gilgamesh, which, believe it or not, is a brilliant piece of literature. Oldest piece of literature. The whole point of it is you must find a meaning to life. But atheists, they say that there is no meaning for life. Like Sartre, when he was an atheist, said, there is no meaning. The only real question in life is when you should commit suicide. if that's true, then there is no meaning of life. Why continue? In this one debate, just on meaning, it was an atheist versus theist debate. This theist says, no, there is meaning in life, and meaning does point to God. Those who believe that there is meaning have a higher rate of survival. And so, and by the way, those who believe life has no meaning, more likely to die sooner. So in this debate, Susan Blackmore, she argues that she's an atheist, that there is no meaning of life. That she says, I just have to pull up my big girl pants and just go through life, even though there's no meaning. And here's the odd part. She makes her life as a counselor. So she tells people that there is no meaning to life, and in the argument says you just have to pretend like there's a meaning to life. Really? So really, all life is waiting for Godot. Just this meaningless trait. I just love the fact that Catholics, we celebrate meaning by anointing our youth. We anoint that their life has a purpose and meaning. So here, I know this sounds kind of strange, but going back to Viktor Frankl, why is it those who believe that God gave them meaning, even in their suffering, they're the ones who survive the concentration camp? Highest rate of survival. People who have a low sense of meaning in their life, higher suicide rate. I'm just saying, if that's one of the atheist tropes, I think it is a proof of God. So my joke, and I know this sounds kind of strange, is I don't have enough faith. I don't have enough blind faith to be an atheist. Now, technically, I started off the class by mentioning the word faith in Greek is pistis. Pistis means trust. But the difference between faith and trust is this. There's a story about this tight walker over in the Niagara Falls that would do this thing of walk across the tightrope, then get a wheelbarrow and fill it with potatoes, and then walk across the line with a wheelbarrow full of potatoes. And the King of England was there, and he saw it. And he said to the King of England, do you believe that I can carry a person into in the wheelbarrow? And the King of England says, I believe you could do it. And he says, if you have faith, get in the wheelbarrow. And I tell the story. There's a difference between belief and faith. The King of England did believe that the tight walker could do it. He didn't have enough faith to get inside the wheelbarrow. But faith is a trust. Now, this sounds kind of strange. Atheism is a form of faith. Their faith is the world is meaningless, just going through all the arguments. Everything's meaningless. All people's experience of God, they don't believe in any of it. Well, really, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. And so atheism is a type of faith. And the worst part is, atheism is a type of fundamentalism. Now, fundamentalism, when I say fundamentalism is not a theological position. Fundamentalism is a psychological position. And with fundamentalists, they find out that there's three concerns that fundamentalists have. One is existential certainty. They're right about all things, and they never allow any doubt. That sounds like, to me, atheists. That, despite all this evidence, they will not believe it. They also have what's called a flattening of values, fundamentalists, that there are no hierarchy of issues, that all issues are to be fought over. And this sounds strange, taking a different... have you heard what wokeism is? Okay, with wokeism, it's a type of fundamentalism, because we might agree on George Floyd's death, but if you don't phrase it just right, they'll attack you. So there's this incident that somebody didn't phrase the George Floyd murder correctly, and they went after them, even though that person was part of the left, because you didn't phrase it this way. That's a flattening of values. You have to strictly believe what I believe. Or religious people do it too. That's a type of fundamentalism where my cousin's son said to his uncle, who helped raise him, who's Catholic, showed up to his door one day, and his son had become an evangelical fundamentalist, shows up to his uncle's door, who cared for him, loved him his entire life, and says, I have to say I'm worried about your salvation, that you're going to burn in hell, because I have never heard you say that you accept Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior. Now, here's the joke. That phrase nowhere appears in the Bible. Jesus is my personal Lord and Savior. That's part of a 19th century Baptist creed. But when I say the flattening of values, the very fact that he's a practicing Catholic, he's a really good person, he helped raise him, none of that's good enough. You have to say the magic words of I accept Jesus as my personal Lord and Savior. Even if you've done all that goodness, it doesn't matter. That's a flattening of values. Atheists are the same way. The third characteristic of fundamentalism is that you're hunting for heretics. You always have an enemy if you're a fundamentalist. So atheists are it's a psychological trait, not a religious position. And atheism is just another form of fundamentalism. It's just secular fundamentalism. So my point being is that they won't accept any evidence. And evidence demands a verdict. So atheists remind me of, in some sense, teenagers. Because there's a sign that I like that it said, "Teenagers, are you tired of being harassed by your parents? Act now. Move out, get a job, and pay your own bills while you still know everything." Atheists are like teenagers because they want to complain the way God works, but they're stealing morality from those who follow God. They fit their own definition of blind faith. They have no sure evidence that God doesn't exist, and yet they're trying to proselytize other people that God doesn't exist. They say that they're only materialists, that the only thing that's true is material evidence. But there's no material scientific evidence that materialism is true. That's blind faith. So it takes a lot of blind faith to believe in the fundamentalism of atheism. Christ commands us to use evidence. He says, love God with all your mind. St. Paul says, give evidence to your faith. So I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. Atheists don't believe in morality, and yet they claim that religious people are immoral. Atheism says that life has no meaning, and yet most people know it's meaning that gives life its value. Atheists say everything has a cause except for the universe. Atheists say that only material things matter except for my conscience that I can't prove. Atheists say that they don't believe anything without evidence except the multiverse or the origins of code or of life. They have no proof of that, yet those things exist. Atheists will say God promoted genocide, except they also believe that they have the right to kill children in the womb. Atheists say religion is evil, but then say they don't believe that evil exists. They say that there is no evidence for God, except for all the evidence I refuse to look at. My point being is that when atheist says, oh, religion is belief without evidence, that's atheism. You just refuse all the evidence, and then you refuse all the evidence, and the only evidence you'll look at is the one that as a teenager you decided. Does that make any sense? So the whole purpose of this class was, anytime you meet an atheist, just two things. There is an answer to all their arguments. It doesn't matter what, there's always an answer. It's just they won't accept the evidence. The real evidence is that, sorry, you're sleeping with your girlfriend, aren't you? It's always a personal reason. It's not evidence. We have the evidence. They just have a personal cause. Does that make sense? So, questions, belief? Oh, I went too long, sorry. Well, we have 2 minutes still. Dying. So, hold on. So, tells a story about this guy who worked with Kubler-Ross on death and dying, then spends a year being with people who died, and he said, nobody dies, they just pass. Which gets me thinking, if you really are a serious atheist, why wouldn't you look for evidence? Why not spend time with the dying? Sorry, go ahead. Is that all? I know this sounds strange. I do believe. Be there when somebody's dying. So often they see the dead. And Steve has a beautiful story. Sorry, Steve. Can I tell your story, even though I want you to put it on the Facebook? You'll have to. I'll miss the story, so correct me. But Steve's dad, did you say your mother took care of your dad most of her life? So his mom had cancer. His dad did a wonderful job taking care of her, but before she died, his dad said, suddenly there was this light, and you said it was like a sunset, this bright light, then suddenly died. Is that right? So there's this great experience. This sounds strange, but when I was a priest, I told somebody this, and they said that they'd seen it too. Like, this sounds kind of strange. If you've been there, sometimes, it didn't happen always with me, but I remember once, there's like the light in the room changed when somebody died. I swear there was some sort of light. That's just a few experiences, but one of the evidence of God, I think, is actually how people die. So just whether we want to look at it or not. Oh, that was the beginning of his dad's conversion. Well, the men in Steve's family have a lot of bone up and around their head, so it took years. All right, well, next time we're going to continue the class in apologetics, but I'm just going to do apologetics against religious fundamentalism, accusations they make against the Catholic faith, and just rebuttals. So, all right, God bless you. I hope I hit the record button.